Chapter 12 of Captivating Bible Stories for Young People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Olivia. Captivating Bible Stories for Young People by Charlotte Mary Yonge. Chapter 12, 12th Sunday. Israel in the Wilderness. First reading. Ye shall not tempt the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 6, verse 16. I told you what sort of place a desert is, and how full it is of stones and rocks and sand, and with no water in it. Do you remember how thirsty Ishmael was in the desert, and how God heard the voice of the lad, and sent an angel to lead his mother to a well of water? When the Israelites had come out of the land of Egypt, they were in a terrible wilderness. Mount Sinai stood up in the midst, and all around were great rocks of red and black marble, all dry and parched with the hot sun shining on them. The Israelites grew very hot and sadly thirsty, but they did not pray as Ishmael had done. They grew angry and said, "Is the Lord among us or no?" Do you not think they deserved that God should show whether he was among them by punishing them for grumbling? That was the way they tempted God. But he was so good and merciful that he pitied them, and he bade Moses to take his rod and go to the bare dry rock and strike it. And when Moses struck the rock, God made a beautiful, fresh, clear spring of water come pouring out of it, so that all the people and all their cows and sheep and goats and camels could drink and be refreshed. Was not that a great wonder? And was not God very kind to them, though they were not good? But you see, God was near to them all the time, and it was very sad that they grumbled instead of praying. Do not be like them. If a thing is hard to bear, don't murmur and grumble about it, but pray, and you will get help. Either the vexing thing will go away, or you will leave off minding it. Second reading. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Gospel of John, chapter 3, verse 14. One great fault of the Israelites was that they had no patience. The moment they saw anything troublesome or difficult, they began to cry out and say they could not get on, and it was very hard on them. Now, it is very wrong ever to say God is very hard upon us, for we may be sure he is doing what is best for us. There was one stony, hot, steep part of the journey still to come, and when the Israelites saw it, they forgot how often God had helped them, and cried out and lamented and complained of him and of Moses. So again they were punished, for the little shining snakes that lived there came out in numbers, darting at them and biting them, so that the bite burnt like fire, and they died. Then they cried out to God and were sorry, and he told Moses of a wonderful way to cure them. Moses was to melt up some brass and make a great serpent, like the little ones that bit them, and set it up on a pole. Then, if anyone who was bitten would come at once and look at the brazen serpent, his bite would get well, and he would not die of it. This was a miracle, a wonder, and it was to teach the Israelites something, and us too. For you know our blessed Lord hung on the cross, as the serpent hung on the pole. And when our souls are in danger of dying of sin, we must think of him and look to him in faith, and he will save us from being punished for our sin and keep our souls from dying. Third reading. He humbled thee and suffered thee to hunger, and fed thee with manna, which thou knewest not. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. This morning you heard how God gave the children of Israel water to drink in the wilderness. Now you shall hear what he gave them to eat. The ground was all hard stones. There was grass which the cows and sheep could eat, and there were a few trees with long, sharp thorns, but no fruit on them, and no corn to make bread, and soon the people were very hungry and began to cry out that they did not know what would become of them. But God was not going to forget them. When they rose up in the morning, the fresh dew lay on the grass, and all about in the dew were little white things that tasted like wafers made with honey. This was called manna, and God had sent it from heaven for them to eat. Every morning on weekdays there it was, and they had all to come out and pick it up. But they must get up early to gather it, for when the sun was hot it would melt away. And they could not keep it. It grew bad and was not fit to use the next day. But there was always just enough for everybody to have all they wanted. There was only one day in each week that more came down, and that was the day before the Sabbath day, which they had instead of Sunday. Then each one could get twice as much as could be eaten in one day, and it did not spoil so fast. For on the Sabbath day God would have them rest, so no manna was to be found anywhere, so that they might learn to keep the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. All the time they stayed in the wilderness, the sweet white manna lay on the grass in the morning for them to pick it up. Twice as much on the 6th day of the week, and on the Sabbath day, none at all. Was not that very good of God? End of chapter 12. Read by Olivia.
Chapter 6 of Captivating Bible Stories for Young People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Captivating Bible Stories for Young People by Charlotte Mary Yonge. 6th Sunday. Joseph in Egypt. First reading. His brethren envied him. Genesis chapter 37, verse 11. I told you how Jacob went away from home and how God promised to take care of him. He did take care of him. He led him to his uncle, and with him Jacob lived many years, and then came back with flocks of sheep and goats, camels and cows, and he had 12 sons. The best one of them was named Joseph. Jacob loved him very much, and gave him a striped dress of many colours, such as the son who is to be the heir wears in these countries. But his brothers hated and envied him, and were all the time finding fault with him. One day when Joseph was 17 years old, 10 of the brothers were out with their sheep, and Jacob desired Joseph to go and see what they were about. He would not tell his father how unkind they were to him, but he went, and as they saw him coming, some of them were so wicked as to say that they would kill him and never let him go home. Reuben, who was the eldest brother, tried to hinder them, but when he saw he could not stop them, he said the best way would be not to kill him, but to let him down into a dry well just by. There they meant to let him starve to death, and they let him down without any pity for him. Reuben meant to come by and take Joseph out of the pit and save him, but there was another brother, named Judah, who did not want to have him killed, and who saw a great party of men with camels and asses laden with goods going on a journey. He knew they were merchants, going to sell and buy in Egypt, and he advised the other brothers to persuade them to buy Joseph, for in those days men and women used to be bought and sold, and were called slaves. So Joseph was drawn up out of the pit, and when the merchants saw what a fine young man he was, they paid the price for him, and carried him off, away from his father and all he had ever known or cared for before. The cruel brothers kept his coloured dress, and they killed a kid, and stained it in the blood, and then carried it to their father, telling him they had found it. Jacob thought some wild beast had met Joseph and killed and eaten him, and he mourned and wept. His sons pretended to comfort him, but not one of them would tell him that Joseph was not dead. Second reading. The Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. Genesis chapter 39, verse 3. So we see Joseph a slave. A slave is a servant who belongs to his master, as his cows and horses do. He gets no wages, and cannot go away, but is bought and sold like cattle. Think of poor Joseph. He was used to live as the son of a great rich prince, wearing a dress of many bright colours, with many servants, and no one to obey but his kind, fond father, and living in a beautiful land, all hill and valley, where he used to feed his father's flocks. But now he was a slave in a strange land, with people speaking a language he did not know, and no one to care for him or say a good word to him, shut up in a house in a town far away from his dear hills. Still he had one comfort, and the best of all. God was with him. He could still pray to God and do his duty. And he did his work well, for God helped him, and everything he did was made to prosper in his hand. Then he was trusted. His master knew that he always took care of everything, as if it was his own, and left all to him, quite sure that it would be safe. But his wicked mistress made up a story that he had behaved ill, and he was put in prison for what he had not done. This sounds hard, but it was God's own way of bringing good to pass, and making Joseph come at last to honour. Very soon he was loved and trusted in his prison, and all he did the Lord made it to prosper. Think about this. Try when you have anything to do, a lesson or a bit of work, to ask God to make it prosper. Then if you try your best, he will help, and it will be sure to turn out well. Then try to deserve to be trusted. That is a great thing. If you always recollect that God sees you, you will do the same when no one is with you, as if all the world were watching, and that is the way to be true and just in all your dealings. If you are only good when you are looked at, you are not like Joseph, but are only doing service outwardly. You must try to live that your parents may, out of sight, know all is right, one law for darkness and for light. Third reading. Do not interpretations belong to God? Genesis chapter 40, verse 8. The young son of Jacob, Joseph, had, been sold by his cruel brothers and made a slave of, and then a wicked falsehood was told about him, and he was put into prison. But wherever Joseph was, he tried to do his duty, and so God blessed him. And the keeper of the prison soon found out how different he was from the others, and let him help. I suppose he helped to carry them their food and wait upon them, and he often could say a few kind good words to them. One day 2 grand people came in as prisoners. One was the chief of all the bakers, who made bread for King Pharaoh, and the other was the king of all his cupbearers, who carried him his wine. Some wrong thing had happened, and they were both suspected of having had something to do with it, so they had been sent to prison. One morning, Joseph saw them both looking more sad than usual, and when he asked what was the matter, they said each had a dream, and they wanted to know what it meant, for the Egyptians used to think a great deal of dreams, and there were men among them who pretended to explain them. Most dreams have no meaning, but these had, and God put it into Joseph's heart to understand them. The cupbearer had dreamt that he saw a vine, and that it had 3 bunches of grapes, and that he was squeezing the juice into the king's cup as he used to do. Joseph said this meant that in 3 days the cupbearer should really hand Pharaoh the cup again, and Joseph begged that when he was free he would tell the king about himself and get him set free. Then the baker told his dream, that he had 3 baskets full of pastry and bread ready for Pharaoh, but that the birds came down and ate them up. Joseph was obliged to tell him that this meant that he would be hanged, and that the vulture and ravens would eat his flesh. So it happened. Pharaoh looked into the matter in 3 days' time. He caused the baker to be hung, and the cupbearer to come back to his old place. But the cupbearer was ungrateful, and forgot all about Joseph in prison, trusting to him. End of chapter 6. Chapter 13 of Captivating Bible Stories for Young People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Captivating Bible Stories for Young People by Charlotte Mary Yonge. 13th Sunday. Balaam and Balak. First reading. Thou shalt not curse the people, for they are blessed. Numbers chapter 22, verse 12. There was a prophet called Balaam. A prophet means a man to whom God made his will known, and who was thus much wiser than other men. This prophet one day saw some rich great men come to his house. They brought him a message that a king named Balak wanted him to come with them, and would give him great rewards for coming. Balaam said he must wait for one night, and God would make known to him what he was to do. And at night God told him he was not to go, for what Balak wanted of him was to curse the children of Israel, and God would not have them cursed. So Balaam said he must not go, and the messengers went away. But Balak sent more princes, still grander men, with larger presents to fetch Balaam. He answered, If Balak would give me his house full of silver and gold, I cannot go beyond the word of the Lord my God, to do less or more. But he had not left off wishing. He begged the messengers to stay and see if God would give him leave to go. And this time God did say he might go, but that he should not say anything about the Israelites but what God put in his mouth. Balaam knew that God was not pleased with him, but he wanted Balak's rewards, and he set off in the morning, riding on his ass. Presently the ass was frightened, and turned out of the road into the field. Balaam was angry at this, and beat the ass. But again the ass turned aside in a narrow walled path, and squeezed Balaam's foot against the wall. He beat her again. Presently in a very narrow road, the poor ass fell quite down for fear, and Balaam was very angry and beat her harder. Then God worked a wonder. He made the dumb ass to speak and ask why he was so cruel to her. He answered that he only wished for a sword to kill her. The ass asked if she had ever been like this before. He said no. And then, full before him, he saw God's holy angel with a sword in his hand, and he fell down on his face. The poor ass had seen the angel all the time, but Balaam could not see him till God made him able. And now he was afraid, and would have gone back, but the angel said he must go on now, though he would only be able to speak the words which God put in his mouth. Think if, sometimes, when you have been told you must not do something, you fret and tease to do it. Is not that like Balaam? And perhaps you tease till someone gives you leave to do as you wish. Then you get quite cross with eagerness, and are unkind to all that hinders you, and, after all, you do not find that any good comes of getting your own way. Second reading. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. There was a king named Balak, whose lands the Israelites were to pass through. They promised not to do any harm to him or his people if they might go quietly through, but he was afraid and angry, and wanted to have them cursed, hoping to bring God's anger on them. That was a very wicked and foolish notion of King Balak's, and God would not let it bring harm upon his people. They had not deserved to have his anger cooled down on them, and so he would not be angry with them. And when Balak's friend Balaam tried to speak curses, God turned them all to blessings, and instead of saying they should come to a terrible end, he could only say how happy and well off they should be with God to take care of them and be their king. He even went on to say that a star should come out of Jacob, and a scepter should rise out of Israel, and that meant that our Saviour should be born among them. He is called a star, because he came to give us light, and you know a star showed the way to the place where he was born, and a scepter is the rod a king carries in his hand. So when he was called the Scepter, it meant that he should be a king. Only think how angry Balak was when Balaam could not curse, but only blessed. I wish he had been afraid, and seen it was not God's will that he should hurt the Israelites. But instead of that, he went on in his wickedness, and was miserably killed at last, for God took care of his people, and would let no one do them any harm. Now, recollect, bad words and bad wishes do harm to the person that speaks them, not to those they are meant for. If a bad boy came and abused a steady one for going to church or saying his prayers, it would be very bad for himself. But if the good boy kept on quietly, nothing that the other could say would hurt him one bit. God would take care of him as surely as he took care of the Israelites. Third reading. The people did eat and bowed down to their gods. Numbers chapter 25, verse 2. You heard how Balaam went to Balak, and how God made him bless the children of Israel when he wanted to curse them. But even this did not make Balaam good. He wanted Balak to give him a reward, and so he told him that though no harm could happen to the people of Israel while they were good and worshipped their God, yet if he could make them do something wicked and turn away from their God, then God would be sure to punish them. So these two wicked men sent a number of women to invite the Israelites to hold a great feast with them, in honor of their idol, Baal Peor. Many were so foolish and wicked as to be led astray, and they had a great feasting and revelling and all kinds of bad pleasures that these heathen women said were to do praise to this horrible false god. Then, though Balak might have cursed for ever without hurting them, they had done themselves the harm. God sent a deadly sickness, and in one day 24,000 people died. But Phinehas, Aaron's grandson, did as Moses commanded him. He first put to death the wickedest of the people who had joined themselves to Baal Peor, and then he prayed, and all the people prayed and wept too, so God forgave them, and the plague ceased. Afterwards, Phinehas led the Israelite fighting men to punish the wicked Balak and his people, and Balaam was killed in fighting with them. All the wicked women who had tempted the Israelites away from God were put to death too. So Balaam's evil counsel ended in all sorts of misery. It is very sad to think of him, for he knew so well what was good, and yet did what was so very bad. But remember this, nobody could hurt God's people till they did wrong, and then they hurt themselves, and God punished them. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of Captivating Bible Stories for Young People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Olivia. Chapter 14, the 14th Sunday. The Giving of the Law. First reading. Thou heardest his words out of the midst of the fire. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 36. When the children of Israel had come out of Egypt, God had told Moses to lead them to the foot of Mount Sinai. This was a high, steep, rocky mountain in the wilderness, and God told Moses to set bounds round the mountain so that nobody should come and touch it, and the people were to pray and wait around it for the holy and awful thing that was to happen. Then there came on the mountain top a deep, dark cloud, and the mountain was altogether on a smoke, and it shook and quaked, and there were lightnings and thunders and voices, and the sound of a trumpet louder and louder, so that all the people trembled. Then out of that cloud there came a voice speaking to them, a voice that they all could hear, and it made them afraid, for it was the voice of God. And God spoke out of the cloud and gave the 10 Commandments. They were the very same 10 Commandments you say in the Catechism and see written up in church. The 10 Commandments. Thou shalt have no more gods but me. Before no idol bend the knee. Take not the name of God in vain, nor dare the Sabbath day profane. Give both thy parents honor due. Take heed that thou no murder do. Abstain from words and deeds unclean, nor steal though thou art poor and mean. Nor make a wilful lie, nor love it. What is thy neighbor's dare not covet. God had come in this terrible and awful manner to speak to them, that all Israel might hear and fear, and take care not to break them. Afterwards God gave these 10 Commandments to Moses, written upon 2 tables, or pieces of stone, written by God himself. That was the way the 10 Commandments were given, by God's own voice speaking to men out of the cloud, amid thunders and lightnings, and the sound of the trumpet, dreadful to hear. And God meant us all to obey the commandments, just as much as he meant the Israelites to obey them. They are his words and must be kept. And if we ask him in our prayers, he will give us help and strength to obey them, so that we may fulfill the promise that was made at our baptism, that we should keep God's holy will and commandments and walk in the same unto our lives' end. Second reading. The Lord talked with you face to face in the mount, out of the midst of fire. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 4. When the lightning and thunder and the loud voice of the trumpet came forth from the cloud on Mount Sinai, and God had spoken the 10 Commandments, he called to Moses to come up and speak with him in the cloud. How wonderful it must have been! Moses was the only man that ever spoke so near to God. God gave him 2 blocks of stone written with the 10 Commandments, written with God's own finger. Then God told him to make a chest to keep them in. It was to be made of wood, with gold all over it, and 2 figures of cherubims were to be, one on each side. This chest was to be called the Ark of the Covenant, and it was to be put into a square room inside a tent that was to be made with curtains and carried about with the Israelites. It was to be called the Tabernacle, and this was to be a very holy place. The children of Israel would say their prayers in front of the tabernacle, but they were not to go into the place where the ark was, because they were sinful and God is holy. That place was to be called the Holy of Holies, and no one might go near it but the priests whom God chose and set apart to lead his worship. The first high priest was to be Moses' brother Aaron, and he was to wear a beautiful dress when he ministered before God, a high cap with "Holiness to the Lord" on it, a long embroidered robe edged with gold bells and pomegranates, and a blue scarf crossed over his breast, and in the middle a breastplate made of 12 precious stones, each carved with the name of one of the 12 tribes of Israel, so that he might have them on his heart as he prayed to God. All this and much more God told Moses while he was on the mount. Third reading. Know therefore that the Lord thy God, he is God. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 9. When Moses went up into the awful cloud upon Mount Sinai, he stayed there for 40 days. But all the Israelites below were impatient. They could not think what had become of Moses, and though they had so lately heard God's own voice speaking to them, They would not wait as they had been told to do. They cried out that they wanted something instead of Moses, whom they had lost. So they took all their gold earrings and melted them, and made an image of a golden calf. And then these foolish, wicked people began to feast and dance and worship this golden idol. Moses was coming down Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the commandments in his hands. And first he heard a shouting and singing, then he saw the people leaping and dancing, and the great golden idol standing in the midst. Then he was sure it was of no use to bring them the commandments if they minded them no better. So he took the 2 tablets of stone and threw them out of his hand and broke them to pieces. Then he went down and severely punished the worst of the Israelites for having disobeyed the commandment. And he broke the golden calf to pieces and ground it into powder. Then he went and prayed to God to forgive the people. God did forgive them, and let Moses bring 2 fresh tables of stone to be written with the 10 commandments. But the first that they had lost were the tables God had given, and they could never have them back again. End of chapter 14. Recorded by Olivia.
Chapter 15 of Captivating Bible Stories for Young People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Captivating Bible Stories for Young People by Charlotte Mary Yonge. 15th Sunday. The Giving of the Law. First reading. I prayed therefore unto the Lord, and said, O Lord God, destroy not thy people and thine inheritance. Deuteronomy chapter 9 verse 26. Last Sunday you heard how sadly the people of Israel sinned by making the golden calf while Moses was up in the mountain, and how he punished them. Then he said he would go and pray to God to forgive them, and try them again. So up he went over the rough rocks of Mount Sinai, and into the cloud again, where he had spoken with God before. And he prayed with all his might that God would not cast off his people, though they had been so wicked, but would give them again the commandments on their tables of stone. And God listened to Moses, and promised to give them the commandments again. Then Moses made a great request. He said to God, I pray thee, show me thy glory. But God said, Thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. But Moses was to come up the mountain the next day, and bring with him 2 blocks of stone, and then God would let him see as much of his glory as he could bear. On the next day Moses went up the mountain again, and took with him the 2 tables of stone. And the Lord came down in the cloud, and Moses was in the cleft of the rock, where he could see a small part of the glory, and hear the Lord's voice proclaim before him, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth. Then indeed Moses bowed his head and worshipped. No man ever came so close to God as Moses, with whom God spoke face to face, as a man speaketh to his friend. Moses stayed 40 days and 40 nights up in the mountain, and God again wrote the commandments upon the 2 tables of stone, and granted the Israelites to try again to keep them. When Moses came down from being in converse with God, the glory was still about his face. It was all shining like the sun, and was so bright that the Israelites could not fix their eyes on it, and he was obliged to put a veil over his face, because they could not bear to look at it. Was ever living man so favoured, and brought into such glory? Second reading. Ye shall walk after the Lord your God, and fear him. Deuteronomy chapter 13 verse 4. When the Israelites came into the good land where they were going, they were to be very careful not to learn to worship idols. For idols were no gods at all, only wood and stone, and could not hear them pray, nor give them what they wanted. Besides, the people round them had very frightful ways of trying to please their false gods. They had one called Moloch, made of brass, and they used to offer poor little children up in sacrifice to him, and make a noise with drums and trumpets that no one might hear their cries. There was another god called Baal, to whom they set up great images and feasted in his honour, and a goddess whom they called the Queen of Heaven, of Ashtoreth. Women used to offer cakes to her, and dance in honour of her, for they thought she sent the moon to shine on them. Now the Israelites were not to worship any of these false gods. They were to remember how they heard the only true God speaking to them out of the cloud upon the mountain, and telling them, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other gods but me. And God told them that if they would worship him and serve him, all should go well with them, and they should be happy and blessed. But if they went after these false idols, all would go ill with them, and there would be only sorrow and misery. Third reading. It is a people that do err in their heart, and they have not known my ways. Psalm 95 verse 10. After the commandments were given, the Israelites went on their journey. The ark, or chest, where the commandments on their 2 tables of stone were kept, was carried before them, and God still showed that he was with them, for he made a pillar of cloud by day and of fire by night go along with them and rest on it. When they came near the land of Canaan, 12 men were sent on to see it. They came back bringing such a great bunch of grapes that 2 had to carry it between them on a pole. But they said that the land was full of strong cities and very strong men, and they should never be able to win it, but would all be killed. Only 2 men, Joshua and Caleb, recollected that there could be no fear, for God had promised to save them and bring them in. The others all cried and said they would go back to Egypt, and threw stones at Moses and Aaron when they wanted to quiet them. Then God showed his glory, and would have cut them all off in a moment if Moses had not prayed for them. But he said none of those who had said they would not go into the good land should go. They were to stay 40 years longer in the dismal wilderness, till all the grown-up men, except Joshua and Caleb, should be dead, and their children be grown up in their stead. Then their children, who had learned to trust God and to do as he bade, should be the ones to go in and live in the promised land. End of chapter 15.